At 3:11 in the morning, my brother called for the 19th time. By 3:26, one of our biggest suppliers had frozen the next day's shipment. At 3:41, our CFO left me a voicemail that began with, "Eli, I need you to call me back before the bank opens." And at 4:02, my younger sister sent the first message that didn't sound angry. It sounded scared. I didn't answer any of them. I sat in the dark at my kitchen table with a glass of water I hadn't touched, watching my phone light up over and over like the house was trying to warn me about a fire I had already smelled hours earlier. 12 hours before that, my family had voted me out of daily operations at the company I had spent 12 years building. They thought they were removing a difficult personality. They thought they were taking back control. What they actually did was trigger a clause none of them had bothered to read, tied to systems none of them understood, inside a business they thought they owned because their names were on paper. That was the part people on the outside never understood about family companies. Everybody likes to talk about ownership. Very few people know where the weight actually sits. My brother assumed the weight sat in titles. My sister assumed it sat in image. My cousin assumed it sat in spreadsheets and business school vocabulary. My parents assumed it sat wherever conflict would least disrupt dinner. Only my grandfather knew where it really sat. And by the time my phone started vibrating across the table like a trapped insect, everybody else was learning it the expensive way. I didn't sabotage anything. That's important. I didn't steal money. I didn't lock anyone out of software. I didn't wipe accounts, poison the books, or torch the place on my way out. I did something much simpler than that. I stopped standing between their arrogance and the structure that had been quietly rewarding it. That was enough. At 4:15, my brother Grant left a voicemail instead of a call. He was breathing hard. Not crying. Grant didn't cry unless there were witnesses who could be useful later. But rattled. That was rarer. "Eli," he said, voice low and sharp, like I had personally insulted the sun. "Call me back. Now." Heritage froze the line. "Dunbar wants cash on delivery until this gets sorted. Donna says the redemption notice triggered a material event review. I don't know what the hell you filed, but you need to unwind it before the stores open." Then the line clicked dead. I listened to it twice. Not because I felt guilty. Because there was a sentence buried in there I had waited years to hear. "I don't know what the hell you filed." That was exactly the problem. He should have known. He should have known because our grandfather had made all of us sign the operating agreement when the company expanded from 1 store to 3. He should have known because I had been begging them for years to read the governance documents they liked to talk around. He should have known because he had spent the last decade telling people he helped run a regional hardware chain. You should probably know how the chain is held together before you try to yank out one of the links. By dawn, I had 63 missed calls, 91 texts, and 2 emails marked urgent from our lender's relationship team. I showered, made coffee, and finally opened the blinds. Sunlight had a rude way of making everything look more normal than it was. The trees outside my place were still. A delivery truck rolled down the street. Somewhere a dog barked twice and quit. The world looked completely uninterested in the fact that my family had managed to turn a decades-old company into a live grenade in less than a day. I took my first sip of coffee and thought, not for the first time, that people mistake calm for cruelty when they're used to you cushioning the consequences for them. I wasn't calm because I enjoyed what was happening. I was calm because this was the first morning in years when the emergency wasn't mine to absorb first. That had always been my role. I was the middle child. Which in my family meant I was old enough to be useful early, young enough to be overlooked later, and reliable enough that everybody slowly began building their expectations on top of me like I was poured concrete. Grant was the oldest. He was handsome in that broad, clean, country club way that made bankers and local chamber people instantly assume he knew what he was talking about. He could shake hands for 3 hours without losing energy, tell a story about our grandfather that made older men nostalgic, and walk through a store for 15 minutes and leave with every employee thinking he'd really seen them. He was also deeply allergic to sustained effort that didn't come with applause. My sister Lily was 9 years younger than me and had perfected the art of appearing overwhelmed by responsibilities she had quietly volunteered for. She had good instincts for aesthetics, better instincts for sympathy, and a dangerous talent for making avoidance sound like a boundary. If she missed payroll deadlines, she was protecting her mental health. If she ignored store complaints, she was refusing negativity. If somebody else cleaned up the mess, she described that as healthy teamwork. My cousin Mason was my aunt's son and the newest member of the circus. He came back from a graduate business program with polished shoes, a deck of buzzwords, and the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been held responsible for a payroll Friday. My parents, Richard and Celia, had spent most of my adult life trying to preserve a version of family peace that always seemed to cost me the most. And my grandfather, Walter Mercer, had started the business with one stubborn store, a busted forklift, and a philosophy so simple it sounded almost too obvious to matter. Know your inventory. Pay your people on time. Read every line before you sign your name. The first two made the business. The third one saved me. By the time people knew us as Mercer Home and Hardware, with 6 stores spread across 3 counties and a distribution warehouse outside of Ashford, the story had already been polished into something Grant loved telling at civic lunches. Granddad built it. Dad kept it going. We scaled it. That was the public version. The truth was uglier, slower, and less flattering to almost everyone but Walter. When I was 23, Mercer Hardware was one bad winter away from becoming a memory with a rusted sign. A national chain had opened 15 minutes up the highway. Our inventory system was basically a collection of guesses and loyalty to vendors who had stopped returning calls quickly. The old store still smelled like fertilizer, rubber hose, and stale coffee, which I actually loved, but love doesn't stop margin bleed. We had cash tied up in dead stock, handwritten reorder logs nobody reconciled, and a back office so disorganized I once found an unsigned insurance renewal form inside a box of Christmas extension cords in March. My father had heart, but not discipline. Grant had charm, but not patience. I had just finished a 2-year logistics program at a state school and had a job lined up in Nashville with a regional distributor. It wasn't glamorous, but it was clean. Predictable. The kind of career where operations mattered more than family mythology. Then Walter had a mild stroke. Not catastrophic. Enough to scare us. Enough to make him slow down. Enough to expose how much of the company still lived inside his head. I came home for what I thought would be 6 weeks. I stayed 12 years. At first, I told myself it was temporary. I would help sort the inventory data, untangle vendor terms, maybe build a proper purchasing process, and once Granddad was stable and Dad had his footing, I'd leave. But the first time I traced a full week of shrink and found it wasn't theft but a pricing sync problem between stores, and fixed it, and watched cash stop leaking out of holes nobody else had even noticed, something dangerous happened. I got useful. And the minute you become the useful one in a family business, people stop asking how long you're staying. They start talking as if you were always there. I built an inventory system that actually matched physical counts to purchase history. I renegotiated terms with suppliers who had been overcharging us because nobody on our side could compare freight breakpoints correctly. I standardized seasonal ordering so every store wasn't making different decisions based on whoever yelled loudest on Monday. I pulled warranty claims out of legal pads and shoe boxes and moved them into a trackable process that got us money back. I learned which managers lied, which ones panicked, which ones could be trusted in a storm, and which ones only looked competent because everyone around them was exhausted. When a summer flood took out one of our smaller locations, receiving bay and insurance dragged its feet, I slept in the store office for 3 nights, juggling emergency transfers and vendor holds so we didn't lose the entire quarter. When a software rep sold us a half-baked point-of-sale upgrade that started double ordering fasteners across 3 locations, I was the one who caught it before the warehouse filled with enough galvanized bolts to hold together a stadium. When the pandemic hit and everybody suddenly needed chainsaws, chest freezers, paint, masks, gloves, patio heaters, and some irrational combination of panic and mulch, I turned our warehouse from a glorified overflow box into a real distribution hub in 11 weeks. That last one made Grant very popular. He went on local radio twice to talk about how Mercer was proud to keep communities supplied during uncertainty. He said we a lot. I was in the warehouse the second time he did it, ankle deep in back orders and pallet wrap, listening through somebody's phone speaker while I tried to figure out whether our bleach shipment had been misrouted again. That was the first time I really noticed the pattern between us. I did the work that made stories possible. He told the stories like he had authored the work. Lily played a different game. She came into the company through culture, which was one of those words that sounds modern enough to survive scrutiny if nobody asks for a measurable outcome. At first, I was actually on her side. We were an old-school business. Store managers could be rough. Hiring was inconsistent. Nobody had updated the handbook in years. We needed someone focused on people. The problem was Lily loved the language of leadership more than the burden of it. She redesigned break rooms before fixing scheduling inconsistencies. She built an Employee Appreciation Month campaign with branded cupcakes and photo boards while 2 locations were short-staffed enough to make lunch breaks theoretical. She posted polished behind-the-scenes videos from stores she had spent 15 minutes visiting and called that field engagement. If anybody pushed back, she acted wounded. If I pushed back, I was making everything operational. Well, yes. Because payroll is operational. Because hiring is operational. Because workers' comp reporting is operational. Because if a store manager is about to walk because HR hasn't answered a harassment complaint in 12 days, a motivational poster and a pizza lunch are not leadership. Still, I covered. That was my habit. I covered for Grant with lenders by translating his broad promises into actual timelines. I covered for Lily by cleaning up the procedural failures behind her glossy updates. I covered for my father because I loved him and because he still talked about the company like it was a family inheritance instead of a living organism that had to be fed with competence every day. And the more I covered, the less visible the load became. That's how these systems train you. You get so good at preventing the collapse that people start assuming the collapse was never possible. By the time the company hit $30 million in annual revenue and started getting written up in regional business journals as a legacy brand successfully modernizing, Grant had a title with president in it. Lily had vice president of people and brand. I had chief operating officer, which sounded important enough until you realized what it meant in practice. It meant when the trucks were late, I got called. When the lenders wanted quarterly covenant explanations, I got called. When the vendor mix got too concentrated, I got called. When the warehouse software glitched, a store manager quit, a distributor wanted to renegotiate, a bank wanted updated reporting, or a customer sued after a ladder injury, guess whose phone rang first? Mine. At first, I thought that meant everyone respected my value. Later, I understood the darker version. Everybody loves the machine until they learn who keeps it running. And once they know who keeps it running, the temptation becomes obvious. Take the output. Diminish the operator. Call it structure. Call it succession. Call it visionary leadership. Just don't call it what it is. Extraction. The first real warning sign that something bigger was forming came 18 months before the vote. Grant started using one phrase over and over. We need to get less dependent on individuals. On its face, it sounded smart. It was smart. Any good operation should survive one person. The problem was the way he used it. He never said it after his own mistakes. He never said it when Lily missed something important. He said it whenever my name came up tied to a problem only I had solved. A store manager in Ridgemont stayed because I stepped in and stopped a bad termination process. We need to get less dependent on individuals. The bank renewed our revolver on better terms because I had spent 6 months cleaning up reporting discipline and inventory turns. We need to get less dependent on individuals. A supplier kept our seasonal credit because they trusted my forecasting and payment accuracy. We need to get less dependent on individuals. He wasn't wrong. He was repositioning. That phrase was a lever. If he kept repeating it, eventually people would start hearing operational risk instead of Eli carries too much. And once that shift happened, he could cast reducing my authority as strategic maturity instead of family opportunism. Lily picked it up next. "You're in too much," she told me one afternoon after a store walk where she spent 10 minutes complimenting end cap signage and missed the fact that receiving had been missing cycle counts for a week. "It makes people feel like they can't lead." I looked at her. "Which people?" She gave me that tired, superior younger sister look she used when she wanted credit for emotional intelligence without the discomfort of specifics. "It's a vibe." A vibe. That word nearly killed me. Not because it was insulting. Because it was so efficient. If there's a number, I can argue with it. If there's a timeline, I can disprove it. A vibe is just a fog bank with lipstick. What exactly am I doing? I asked. "You're everywhere," she said. "It makes everything feel like it has to go through you." It does go through me. Because when it doesn't, we get surprises. She sighed. "That's exactly what I mean." That was Lily in one exchange. The evidence was my problem. Her discomfort was leadership insight. I remember telling my grandfather about that conversation while we sat in the warehouse office after hours. He was 84 then and had started coming in only twice a week, mostly to review old store property paperwork, complain quietly about waste, and drink coffee strong enough to strip paint. He listened without interrupting, then said, "You know what people call the person they depend on most right before they decide to resent him?" I waited. He didn't smile. A bottleneck. That landed hard because it was true. Not true in the way Grant meant it. True in the way older men say things when they've already seen the movie. What am I supposed to do with that? I asked. Walter looked over at me. Read your papers again. That was how he gave advice when he knew direct warning would only make you argue. Read your papers again. Not watch your brother. Not trust your instincts. Read your papers. I went home that night and pulled our operating agreement out of the fireproof box I kept in my hall closet. Not because I thought something dramatic was about to happen. Because Walter didn't waste words. The agreement had started as a simple set of documents when Mercer was still basically one store and a lot with 2 rusting trailers. It had been amended when we brought in family members as equity holders, amended again when we reorganized into an LLC structure to support expansion, and refined one last time when the warehouse and distribution arm were split under the same holding umbrella for financing reasons. It was dry, dense, full of sections everyone except me treated like wallpaper. But buried in there was something Walter had fought for years earlier after his own brother nearly boxed him out of a feed business he'd helped build in his 20s. A member redemption trigger tied not just to ownership, but to constructive removal. If a voting coalition materially stripped a managing member of authority, responsibilities, or access in a way that impaired his economic position or operational function, he could force a redemption or force a dissolution sequence unless all parties agreed otherwise. Most people hear buyout clause and imagine a clean check with a bow on it. That's not what this was. This was a shotgun shell dressed as governance language. It existed for one reason. To stop exactly the kind of family coup my grandfather had once survived the hard way. I read it twice. Then I read our debt agreements. That was where the real weight lived. Our revolving line of credit had expanded 3 years earlier during the warehouse build-out. The bank had granted better terms partly because of performance, partly because of collateral, and partly because of continuity assurances tied to key management and personal guarantees. Not just mine, but mine mattered. So did vendor rebate agreements negotiated in my name as operating officer. So did signatory authorizations tied to inventory purchasing controls. So did the custom forecast procedures only 3 people in the company actually knew how to use correctly, 2 of whom worked for me and were loyal to the system, not the family. You can inherit ownership faster than competence. That line came to me while I was reading. I wrote it in the margin. Then I put the binder away and went back to work the next morning, because nothing had happened yet. The thing about betrayal in businesses like this is that it rarely starts with one obvious scene. It starts with little edits. Grant began scheduling strategy lunches that somehow never required me until after the decisions were framed. Lily started using outside consultants in language audits and culture reviews, then forwarding me summary slides that turned operational discipline into centralized control risk. Mason came in 6 months after finishing his MBA and behaved like the building owed him applause for entering it. He was 27, broad-shouldered, polite when upward-facing, and permanently amused by anybody over 30 who had built knowledge the slow way. At first, I tried. That's my unfortunate specialty. I tried. I brought him into forecasting calls. I walked him through vendor seasonality, cash conversion realities, and why gross margin percentages mean different things when half your customers still expect contractor terms on a handshake and a local reputation. I took him through 3 stores and showed him how a weak garden center manager can ruin a quarter without ever understanding he's doing it. I even explained, one night over takeout in the conference room, why our company could never be run entirely from dashboards. He listened with that graduate school face young men wear when they're waiting for you to stop talking so they can use your experience as material for their own opinion. 2 weeks later, he put together a deck called Leadership Transition Opportunities. Grant loved it. Of course he did. It gave him charts. Charts are catnip for people who want to move power without sounding emotional. The deck said the company had key person risk concentrated in operations. The deck said organizational maturity required distributed decision rights. The deck said next-generation leadership integration was overdue. The deck did not mention that next-generation leadership was a cousin who had never seen a month-end scramble from the inside. One afternoon, I walked into the warehouse training room while Grant, Lily, Mason, and an outside consultant were mid-discussion. They all went slightly still in that way people do when they've been using their name in a room and the furniture suddenly learns to talk. Grant smiled. There he is. We were just talking about reducing friction points. I set a file folder down on the table. If by friction points you mean me making sure purchase orders match open liabilities, then yes. I recommend reducing those only if you enjoy fraud. The consultant laughed weakly. Grant didn't. Later that day, my father called me into his office. He still had the original office from the old store days at the flagship location, even though he only came in 3 or 4 times a week by then and spent more time reading trade magazines than making decisions. He shut the door and leaned against his desk. You don't have to fight every adjustment, he said. I stared at him. I'm not fighting adjustment. I'm fighting theater. He winced a little, which meant he knew exactly what I meant and didn't like that I'd said it plainly. They're trying to grow, he said. No, I said. They're trying to move me out from under the growth. That was the closest my father ever came to choosing the truth over comfort. He looked tired. Older than I was ready to admit. Then he said, just don't make this a family thing. I almost laughed. As if it had been anything else for years. The message that finally made the collision unavoidable came on a Monday night. Not a dramatic group chat line like a movie. That would have been too honest. It was a calendar invite. Executive alignment session. Tuesday, 8:30 a.m. required attendance, ownership group. Then, 6 minutes later, Mason dropped a thumbs up emoji in the family business thread. Not to the invite. Just in the thread. No context. No words. Just enough smugness to tell me the room had already been arranged before I walked into it. I knew then. Not every detail. Enough. That night I didn't sleep much. Not because I was panicking. Because there are moments when your mind shifts from hurt to inventory. What are they actually doing? What have they lined up? Who knows? What are my obligations? What are my rights? Where are the pressure points if they think they can strip authority but keep the engine? I got up at 1:20, sat at my desk, and reread the agreement again. Then I emailed Marlene Pike, our company attorney, requesting at 10:30 hold the next morning. Not urgent, I wrote. Just in case. Her reply came 4 minutes later. I'll keep it clear. That was Marlene. Never dramatic. Which made it comforting when she made room fast. The meeting started exactly how bad family business meetings always start. Coffee nobody drank. Folders nobody opened. Too much eye contact from the person about to do something ugly. I walked into the conference room at the Ashford office and found Grant sitting at the head of the table like he had already inherited the frame. Lily was beside him with her phone turned face down but close enough to touch. Mason had a legal pad open in front of him and the expression of a man who thinks note-taking is a substitute for authority. My mother and father were there too. That was what made it family. The fact that they didn't belong in the operating decision, but they were present to witness it anyway. Grant waited until I sat. Then he folded his hands and gave me the exact voice people use when they want to call a mugging a realignment. We've been talking about the next phase, he said. About what the company needs if it's going to grow beyond founder-era habits. I said nothing. He continued. We have too much key person concentration in operations. It's not sustainable. It's creating bottlenecks, confusion, and morale issues. So we've decided to restructure leadership. Lily jumped in. We want you focused on projects and transition support, she said. Higher level work. Less direct management pressure. It's better for everyone. Mason slid a sheet across the table like he was presenting peace terms to a defeated province. I looked at it. Proposed executive transition framework. They weren't reducing my workload. They were removing my operational authority, cutting reporting lines, reassigning purchasing approvals, and placing Mason as acting head of multi-unit operations under Grant's executive oversight. In plain English, they wanted my relationships, my systems, and my results. They just didn't want me attached to them anymore. I looked up. When did you decide this? Grant answered too quickly. It's been a conversation. That means yes, and for longer than he wanted to admit. How long? Lily crossed her arms. Does that matter? Yes. Mason spoke for the first time. We're trying to future-proof the company. There is something uniquely dangerous about inexperienced men using phrases they learned from PowerPoint decks to justify disrespect. I turned toward him. You've been here 9 months. He held my stare for about 2 seconds, then looked back at his pad. Grant leaned forward. Don't do that. This isn't personal. That lie almost made me admire him. This is exactly personal, I said. You're removing me from the role that built the structure you're standing on. It's called succession, Lily said. No, I said. Succession has a plan. This is an extraction. My father shifted in his seat. My mother looked down. Grant exhaled. We're taking a vote. That was the moment I stopped trying to salvage anything. Not because of the vote. Because of the certainty in his face. They had already counted me as absorbed. As somebody who would argue, maybe get angry, maybe leave the room, then come back and keep carrying the load because that was what I always did. That was the real disrespect. Not the decision. The assumption. I leaned back and looked at each of them in turn. Grant, flushed with executive theater. Lily, offended by friction. Mason, trying not to smirk. My parents, hoping the room would solve itself without them having to name what was happening. Then I said, very calmly, if you materially remove me from operations, I'll trigger redemption. The room went still. Grant actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because people laugh when they hear a line they've already decided can't cost them anything. That's not how this works, he said. I held his gaze. That's exactly how it works. Mason's pen stopped moving. Lily frowned. What are you talking about? I looked at my father. He looked away first. That told me all I needed to know. He knew the papers existed. He just didn't think I would use them. I stood up. Take your vote, I said. You don't need me here for that. Grant's voice sharpened. Sit down. I didn't. You wanted less dependence on one person, I said. You're about to find out what that costs. Then I walked out. My phone rang before I reached the parking lot. Marlene. You saw the meeting materials, she asked when I picked up. Enough. Do you want to proceed? I looked back at the building through the conference room glass. Grant was standing now. Lily was talking with both hands. Mason looked smaller from a distance. Yes, I said. Draft it. By 1:15, I was in Marlene's office reviewing the notice. By 3:40, it had been delivered to the company, copied to lender counsel, and filed according to the operating agreement's procedure. It was not flashy. Good legal paperwork never is. But its effect was clean. Because the ownership group had materially stripped a managing member's authority without negotiated redemption terms, I was invoking my right to force a purchase of my units at current appraised value under the agreement's expedited mechanism. If they failed to fund or secure the redemption within the contractual window, dissolution procedures and lender review rights would activate. The valuation from the last financing event put my stake north of $12 million. That was just the start. Once the notice hit, a chain of things moved that my family had never bothered learning because I had spent years handling them before they became visible. The bank's relationship team flagged a material governance event tied to key management and guarantee review. Two major suppliers, both of whom had extended favorable terms partly based on operating continuity and my purchase sign-off history, paused automatic releases pending authority clarification. Our insurer requested updated leadership disclosures. Donna Reese, our CFO, who was competent and tired and had spent years quietly appreciating that somebody besides her understood how the place actually worked, called me once, then sent a text. Did you really file it? I replied. Yes. 3 dots appeared. Then, they did this to themselves. That was the first validating thing anybody inside the company had said all day. At 6:10, Grant called. I let it ring out. At 6:12, Lily called. Then my father. Then Mason. Then my mother. At 7:03, Grant texted, "You're making a massive mistake." At 7:09, Lily sent, "This is unbelievably cruel." At 7:14, my father sent, "Come talk before this gets worse." That one almost got a response. Almost. But there was nothing left to talk about that wasn't already in writing. At 8:47, a store manager named Deb from our North Ridge location texted me privately. "They're saying you're stepping back. Is that true?" I stared at that for a moment. She had been with us 14 years. Knew every regular contractor in a 60-mile radius by first name and truck sound. Had once driven a pallet jack with a broken wrist because a seasonal temp vanished and the morning load had to get unloaded. I typed back. I'm not stepping back. They pushed. I filed. Keep your team focused and talk to Donna for anything urgent. She replied almost immediately. Copy that. For what it's worth, people know who runs this place. I sat there with that message glowing in my hand and felt something ugly loosen inside me. Because that was the part family stories erase first. The witnesses. The people who are not blood, not obligated to flatter you, not invested in household peace. The ones who see who actually shows up. By 10:30, the first outside call came from Sam D'Angelo at Dunbar Industrial Supply, one of our biggest regional vendors. I answered that one. Tell me straight, he said. No hello. That was Sam. You gone or not gone? They removed my authority, I said. I filed under the agreement. I'm no longer giving operational assurances beyond transition compliance. He was quiet for a second. Then, you know what that does on our end? I do. Grant thinks this is temporary. Grant thinks a lot of things. A short breath on the line that might have been a laugh. I'm putting them on controlled release until the bank settles governance, he said. No surprises from me. But no open runway either. That's fair. He paused. You carrying any bad blood with the warehouse team? That question told me exactly where his mind was. Not on invoices. On execution. No, I said. They'll do their jobs. Will management? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. By midnight, I knew the next morning would be ugly. I also knew something else. For the first time in years, ugly didn't automatically mean mine. That was when I slept. Not because I was heartless. Because exhaustion feels different when you are no longer using it to keep other people comfortable. I woke at 6:20 to the phone vibrating again. Grant's messages had changed tone overnight. At 12:11 a.m., call me. At 1:03 a.m., this is insane. At 2:18 a.m., we can work something out. At 3:41 a.m., Heritage froze the line. Call me now. At 5:06 a.m., you made your point. That one almost made me smile. I had not made my point yet. The consequences had barely begun talking. I was pouring a second cup of coffee when Walter called. He never called before 7. Come by the old store, he said. No greeting. No questions. Now? Before they get there. Then he hung up. The old store was where he went when he wanted silence without witnesses. We kept it open as a flagship and nostalgia piece, but it still had the original back office with wood paneling, a fan that clicked every fourth rotation, and a filing cabinet older than most of our assistant managers. When I got there, he was already inside with a yellow legal pad and a coffee mug that said Mercer in chipped blue letters. He didn't ask how I was. He pointed to the chair across from him. You filed? Yes. He nodded once. They read it? Apparently not until now. He made a sound that was part disgust, part vindication. Then he said something I had not expected. Good. I stared at him. Walter looked at me over the rim of his mug. You think I put that language in there for decoration? No, I put it there because family is the fastest thing in the world to start using your loyalty as collateral. That was the closest he had ever come to speaking emotionally about his own history. I had known the outline. Not the full shape. Years earlier, before I was born, his older brother had tried to corner him out of a feed partnership after Walter had turned around the books and stabilized supplier terms. The brother wanted control without having to admit where the value sat. Walter got burned badly enough that when he built Mercer, he swore nobody doing the real work would ever be trapped inside ownership that could turn on them. They thought you'd stay anyway, he said. Yes. Will you? That was the question, wasn't it? Not whether I could force the clause. Whether I would fold once the panic started. I looked around the old office. At the pegboard wall. The faded calendar from a fertilizer company nobody used anymore. The window that faced the loading area where I had spent my 20s learning freight math and disappointment. I won't go back the way they want, I said. Walter nodded slowly. That's the right answer. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then he slid the yellow pad toward me. On it was a list in his blocky handwriting. Heritage line. Vendor term exposure. Warehouse lease guarantee. Quarterly rebate waterfall. Real estate security options. I looked up. What is this? The things they still don't know you hold together, he said. That was Walter. Not sentimental. Precise. He tapped the page. Grant thinks this is about title. Lily thinks this is about emotions. Mason thinks this is about org charts. It's about continuity. If they want you out, make them look straight at continuity and tell the truth about what it costs. I'm not trying to destroy it. I know. That's why you'll win. That line stayed with me longer than anything else he said that day. Not because it felt triumphant. Because it named the difference between what my family was accusing me of and what I was actually doing. I wasn't burning the company down. I was refusing to let them keep treating my restraint like a permanent subsidy. At 8:15, Marlene called to say the company wanted an emergency ownership meeting by noon. At the warehouse conference room, she said. They've asked for Walter to attend. Will he? Walter answered before I could. Yes. Marlene heard him and laughed softly. Good. Bring coffee. They sound terrible. They did sound terrible. By the time we got to the warehouse office, the place felt like a body bracing for bad news. People weren't panicking openly, but the air was wrong. Too careful. Too quiet in corners where there should have been ordinary Monday noise. Donna met my eyes as I walked in and gave me the slightest nod. That meant, they know enough now to be afraid. Inside the conference room, Grant looked like he hadn't slept. Lily had the brittle brightness people wear when they're trying to present themselves as composed to avoid collapsing. Mason had lost the polished confidence and found the first shadow of real adult consequences. My parents were there again. Of course they were. Nothing says professional leadership transition like having your mother in the room for the debt review. Grant started before anyone sat fully. This has gone far enough. Marlene, who was on speaker from her office, said, That's not a legal position, but go on. Grant ignored her. We need to pause the filing and figure out a family solution. I sat down across from him. There was room for a family solution before you voted to strip my authority. Lily jumped in. No one stripped you of anything. We were trying to transition. Donna, who had not spoken yet, said quietly, You removed his reporting structure, purchasing approval, and multi-unit oversight authority. That is not a transition. The room turned. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Because once somebody other than me starts translating the truth into plain English, the script gets harder to control. Mason tried to recover it. The intention wasn't hostile. Walter spoke for the first time. The intention doesn't matter once the paper moves. That silenced the room better than shouting would have. Grant turned toward him. Granddad, you know Eli's overreacting. Walter didn't raise his voice. No. I know you're underprepared. He said it so flatly that even Lily didn't try to soften it. Then Donna opened a folder and began laying out the facts. The bank had suspended discretionary draws on the revolver until governance, guarantee support, and redemption funding exposure were clarified. Dunbar and Northline had both shifted us to controlled release, which meant no ordinary automatic shipment flow without elevated approval. A third supplier had not frozen terms but requested direct assurance on payment cadence, which was corporate language for "we don't trust your house right now." Our quarterly rebate structure was tied to order consistency thresholds that could be blown if purchasing discipline slipped during the dispute. And because the redemption notice created a valuation and funding event, our lender wanted a credible plan by the close of the next business day. Grant kept interrupting with versions of the same complaint. "This is because Eli made it a crisis." Donna finally looked straight at him. "No," she said. "This is because governance events have consequences." That was when I knew she was done protecting anyone's feelings. My mother started crying quietly. Not loud enough to halt the meeting. Just enough to remind everyone that family discomfort was always supposed to outrank operational reality. Lily immediately turned to her. "Mom, please. That one word told me everything. Please don't make this look like what it is." Grant rubbed both hands over his face. "What do you want?" he asked me. That question comes late from people who never asked it when it mattered. I answered anyway. "Not what you think." "Then say it." Marlene's voice came through the speaker. "Before he answers that, let me clarify the menu. You can fund redemption at appraised value. You can negotiate an alternative secured separation. Or you can fail to resolve this and invite dissolution procedures and lender-directed triage." Mason swallowed visibly. Lily said, "You're talking about blowing up Grandpa's company." I looked at her. "No. I'm talking about charging you for pretending I was optional." That landed. Grant leaned forward. "We can restore your role." There it was. Not apology. Not acknowledgement. Not "you were right." Just a panicked attempt to stuff the backbone back into the building after they heard the Beams complain. I shook my head. "No." Lily blinked. "No? You don't get to test whether I'll tolerate disrespect and then call it a misunderstanding when the bill arrives." My father finally spoke. His voice sounded old in a way I hadn't heard before. "Son, nobody's saying that." I turned to him. "What exactly are you saying?" He had nothing. That was the tragedy of my father. Not cruelty. Cowardice wrapped in softness. He could feel the truth and still choose the version of events that asked the least of him. Walter pushed the yellow pad forward. "Here's what he wants," he said. Not because he was speaking for me. Because he knew I would speak better once the room understood this was not a hostage negotiation for their comfort. He started ticking items off with one thick finger. First, no return to prior role. That window closed yesterday. Grant opened his mouth. Walter ignored him. Second, if they want to avoid immediate dissolution, they secure redemption on terms that are real, not emotional. Real estate. Personal guarantees. Payment structure. Not promises. Lily looked horrified. "Personal guarantees?" Walter gave her a long look. "You wanted operational control. That comes with adult signatures." That line almost broke something in Grant's face. Because up until then, even in panic, some part of him had still assumed the cost would be theoretical. That the money problem would sit abstractly on the company while the family remained somehow separate from it. He was finally realizing what I had known for years. He wanted authority without exposure. That is not leadership. That is costume jewelry. Marlene cut in again. "If we structure secured redemption over time, the company may preserve continuity. But the collateral has to be credible. And management authority has to match liability." Donna added, "And if Eli exits, the bank is going to require new process oversight immediately. Which means you can't hand operations to Mason and call it succession." Mason tried to speak. Donna didn't even look at him. "You are not ready," she said. It was not mean. It was worse. It was accurate. He went quiet. The meeting stretched for 3 hours. That's what people never show in stories like this. Not just the mic drop moments. The grinding middle where fantasy has to meet paperwork. Grant cycled through every version of the same emotional strategy. Anger. This is vindictive. Minimization. You're blowing normal disagreement out of proportion. Appeal to legacy. What would Granddad want? Appeal to sacrifice. We all put years into this. Appeal to appearances. What are people going to think if this gets out? I answered all of them the same way. With specifics. You removed my authority without negotiated terms. You assumed I would absorb the insult and continue carrying the load. You counted on me protecting the company from the consequences of your disrespect. That last one was the hardest for them to hear, because it was true in both business and family language. Lily had her own line of attack. Family loyalty. She used the phrase so many times it started sounding like a cough. How can you do this to family? I finally looked at her and said, how did you do it to family first? She went pale. Not because it was loud. Because I said it without heat. There is something much harder to resist when the person you counted on finally stops performing their pain for you. By late afternoon, the outline of a settlement started taking shape. Not a rescue. A reckoning. I would not return to operations. My units would be redeemed over a structured schedule secured by 2 pieces of company-owned real estate and personal guarantees from Grant and my father, because Grant could not credibly sign a loan and the bank knew it. Management would be restructured under outside oversight, not cousin fantasy. Donna would remain in place with expanded authority. An external operating advisor would be brought in immediately. Major purchasing approvals would require dual sign-off for 6 months. And the company would issue a formal internal memo clarifying that I had separated through governance dispute and negotiated redemption, not because I had stepped back voluntarily. That last item mattered to me more than I expected. Because stories calcify fast in family systems. Leave them unattended and the people who benefited most from your labor will suddenly remember themselves as the ones who empowered you all along. I wanted the record straight. Not for revenge. For oxygen. The moment that surprised me most came near the end. My mother, who had cried quietly through half the meeting and said almost nothing useful, suddenly turned toward Grant and said, "You knew this could happen, didn't you?" Grant stared at her. "No, you knew there was language in the agreement." "I didn't know it worked like this." "That's not what I asked." The room got still. Because in all the years of my family orbiting his confidence, I had never seen my mother put a straight question between Grant and his own self-protection like that. He didn't answer right away. That told me enough. He hadn't understood the full blast radius. But he had known there was risk. He just thought, like everybody else, that I would never use it. He thought my loyalty had become infrastructure. He thought wrong. After the meeting, as people filtered out in stunned clumps, Donna caught me in the hallway. "For what it's worth," she said, "you should have done this 2 years ago." I laughed once. "Probably." She studied my face. "Are you okay?" Nobody in my family had asked me that all week. I thought about it honestly. "I think I'm going to find out." She nodded once. Then she said, "For the record, they never understood what you held together." That was the second validating sentence I'd received in 2 days. It meant more than I wanted to admit. The next month was a study in how quickly people confuse survival with recovery. The company did not collapse. That disappointed some people, which is always revealing. If you enforce a boundary in a family or business, there will always be observers who treat anything short of catastrophe as proof you overreacted. But the absence of collapse did not mean the structure hadn't changed. It meant the cost got redistributed. Exactly as it should have. Grant signed papers with a hand that shook the first time he realized his own assets were now attached to the very continuity he used to speak about like a branding exercise. My father stopped talking about keeping things simple. Funny how complexity becomes real the minute your own signature matters. Lily took a 6-week mental health leave after discovering HR becomes less glamorous when legal actually needs response times. Mason remained in the office, but the smirk left him. He spent more time listening. That was probably the first useful thing that had happened to him professionally. The bank kept the line active under modified conditions, but no one mistook that for confidence. It was a probationary mercy tied to stronger controls and actual adult supervision. We hired an outside operations advisor named Marcia Velez, who had turned around 2 industrial distributors and had absolutely no patience for family mythology. She wore steel-toe boots to her first walkthrough and asked Grant a question on day 1 that I wish I'd had framed. What exactly do you do that the business would miss in 48 hours? He hated her immediately. Which, to me, was an excellent sign. I spent those weeks doing something I hadn't done in years. Nothing urgent. I slept. I cooked food before 10 p.m. I called people back when I wanted to, not because a building somewhere had decided to smoke. I took long drives with no phone charger in the car just to feel what it was like to be unreachable without the world ending. And because real life hates emotional symmetry, I also spent a ridiculous amount of time in lawyer meetings and valuation reviews and redemption scheduling. Peace, it turns out, can require a depressing amount of paperwork. Grant kept trying, in small ways, to renegotiate the emotional terms even after the legal ones were set. He called one Sunday afternoon and said, "We're all paying for one bad meeting." I said, "No. You're paying for years of assuming I'd keep covering." Silence. Then, "That's not fair. There are sentences that reveal a whole person in 5 words. That was one of them. Not fair." As if fairness had been offended only once the invoice reached his side of the desk. Another time, Lily came by my place unannounced with store-brand muffins and a face full of carefully arranged sadness. She sat on my couch and tried to explain how overwhelmed she had been, how the company made everyone weird, how she had never meant to gang up on me. I listened. Really listened. Because there was a time in my life when I would have accepted almost any explanation if it promised less loneliness afterward. Then she said, "You know how strong you are. You always handle things." That did it. Because there it was. The whole mechanism in one sentence. Their dependence had always been disguised as praise. I looked at her and said, "Strength isn't consent." She started crying. I did not soften it. She left 20 minutes later with the muffins untouched on my counter and, for the first time in our adult lives, no promise for me to make it easier on her later. Walter came by 2 days after that. He walked through my townhouse like he was inspecting a job site, frowned at my coffee maker, and sat at my kitchen table without invitation. "That your sister?" he asked. "Was." He nodded like that confirmed a weather pattern. Then he reached into his coat pocket and set a small brass key on the table. I frowned. "What's that?" "Office 3 at the old warehouse annex." I stared at him. He shrugged. "Still in my name. Been empty 7 years." I looked from the key to his face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he replied, "that you've spent 12 years building everybody else's future inside my company. Might be time you built one of your own." That was Walter's version of tenderness. A key and a challenge. I took it. 3 months later, I opened Mercer Industrial Systems out of that annex. Not a retail chain. Not a family brand museum. A lean distribution and inventory consulting operation focused on contractor supply programs, regional procurement optimization, and warehouse process cleanup for independently owned hardware groups that were too big to stay sloppy and too small to hire a national firm. In plain English, I got paid to solve the exact problems I had spent a decade solving while other people posed in ribbon cuttings. The first client came from a conversation Sam at Dunbar had over lunch with a dealer in another county who was tired of losing margin to chaos. The second came because Donna, without telling me until later, had mentioned my name to a banker who knew two operators struggling with inventory drift. By month 6, I had 4 clients, a leased forklift, 1 assistant who actually answered emails on the day they arrived, and more peace in my body than I had felt since my early 20s. Meanwhile, Mercer Home and Hardware survived, but survival is not vindication. They sold 1 underperforming location to stabilize cash. They hired a real HR director after Lily's Culture First system nearly got them hit with a labor claim over reporting delays. Grant lasted 8 months under outside operational oversight before he began complaining to anyone who would listen that the company had become too bureaucratic. Which was rich, given that he had mistaken my competence for natural scenery for more than a decade. Mason stopped talking about transformation and started asking Donna for help before meetings. That may have been the first responsible decision of his adult life. My father came by my office once during that first year. He stood in the doorway looking at the shelves, the clean labeling, the whiteboard of project timelines, and the simple fact that I had built something new without asking anybody for permission. He looked older than he had in the warehouse conference room. Not broken. Just finally aware of his own weight in the story. "I didn't think you'd actually leave for good," he said. There it was again. The assumption underneath everything. I leaned back in my chair. "I know." He looked at the floor for a long second. Then he said the closest thing to honesty I had ever heard from him. "I thought you'd cool off and come back." I could have punished him then. Could have listed every time he stayed quiet when speaking mattered. Every time he chose peace over accuracy and called that wisdom. Every time he let Grant take the front and me take the weight. Instead I just said, that was the problem. He nodded once. No defense. No appeal. Just a man old enough to hear the truth and too late to change the years behind it. Before he left, he glanced around the office again and asked, "Are you doing well?" That was the first time he had ever asked me that without the question secretly meaning, "Are you stable enough to keep being useful to us?" I answered honestly. "Yes." He nodded. Then he looked at the shelves, the clipped order forms, the clean receiving board, and said, almost to himself, "Looks like it." After he left, I sat there for a long time thinking about how strange it is when the people who know you least are sometimes the ones most shocked by your actual shape. That first Christmas after the split, the whole family gathered at my parents' house. I almost didn't go. Not because I was afraid of conflict. Because I was tired of translated reality. But Walter called and said, "Show up. Let them see what leaving cost." So I did. Grant was louder than usual, which meant he was nervous. Lily was sweeter than usual, which meant she wanted something from the atmosphere. Mason avoided me for the first hour, then cornered me near the coffee urn and said, "For what it's worth, I didn't realize how much you handled." A year earlier that sentence would have soothed me. Now it just sounded late. "Most people don't," I said. He nodded. "I'm figuring that out." I almost respected him for saying it plainly. Almost. Later, while everybody was settling into dessert and my mother was trying too hard to make the table feel normal, a family friend asked Grant how the company was doing. He smiled automatically. "Steady," he said. "Tough year, but steady." Walter, from the far end of the table, said, "Expensive lesson, though." Nobody spoke. He cut his pie carefully and added, "A company can survive a bad quarter easier than it survives contempt for the person carrying it." My mother closed her eyes. Grant set down his fork. Lily looked like she wanted to evaporate. I did nothing. That was the gift I had finally learned to give myself. Not every truth needed my voice attached to it. Some of them had earned enough witnesses to walk into the room on their own. I still get asked sometimes whether I regret it. Whether I regret pulling the claws. Whether I regret not folding once the panic started. Whether I regret forcing the people I love to face costs they had never imagined landing in their laps. The answer is no. Not because it was painless. Not because I stopped loving them overnight. Not because I enjoyed the fear in those calls at 3 in the morning. I don't regret it because there are moments when staying would have cost more than leaving ever could. People hear stories like mine and imagine the turning point was the legal notice. Or the lender freeze. Or my grandfather siding with me. It wasn't. The turning point happened much earlier, in a conference room full of people who had mistaken my consistency for compliance. It happened when I finally understood that they didn't just want my work. They wanted the right to diminish it while continuing to benefit from it. That is the kind of arrangement that can eat a person alive if he stays inside it long enough. I think about one sentence from that year more than any other. Not one of the dramatic ones. Not the calls. Not the threats. Not the legal language. It was something Walter said in the old office over burnt coffee and a yellow legal pad. Family is the fastest thing in the world to start using your loyalty as collateral. He was right. And the dangerous part is how often they make it feel noble while they do it. They call you dependable. Steady. The strong one. The one who always shows up. If you're not careful, you start hearing those labels as love instead of warning signs. I was the middle child who actually showed up. For years, that made me indispensable. Then it made me inconvenient. Then, finally, it made me free. The funniest part is that people still tell the story wrong when they only know the outline. They say my family tried to push me out and I took my shares with me. That's not what happened. What happened is much simpler. They thought I held a title. I was holding the load. And the moment I set it down, the building noticed first.